I think you're in for a treat. So with our final speaker, Richard Offen, speaking Heroes, Villains and Vagabonds. If that's not enough to get you in, then I'm not sure what else would be. So Richard retired in 2017, and I'm going to say in inverted commas, apparently, after 13 years as Executive Director of Heritage Perth. During that time, he was able to immerse himself in the history of Perth and Western Australia. In retirement, he writes, takes walking tours of the city's historic sites, and is a popular lecturer on the subject. Richard also remains a regular broadcaster on both radio and television. Richard has been a member of the Heritage Council since 2019, and I don't think that sounds like it's very retiring. So please join me in welcoming Richard.
Thank you. As you'll see in a minute, I am the bitter end. You're nearly there, nearly over. We've been talking about ecosystems, and natural ecosystems have their flowers and their weeds. History shows that there have been flowers and weeds in the human history as well. And that's how this talk came about, Heroes, Villains and Vagabonds. It, however, comes with a bit of a caveat. Perth is well known for only having half a degree of separation. Therefore, I try very hard not to suggest which category any of these subjects come into. That way I don't end up with a libel or a slander writ, hopefully, or a punch-up round the back of the bike sheds. So, let's start. Bushrangers. Now, bushrangers originally referred to runaway convicts in the early years of British settlement here, so over in the east. The bushrangers were the ones who had the necessary survival skills to use the Australian bush as their refuge to hide from the authorities. And the term bushranger then evolved to refer to those who abandon their social rights and privileges and take up robbery under arms as a way of life, using the bush as their base. And these bushrangers really are roughly analogous to the British highwaymen of the 18th century and 19th century, and the American Old West road agents. And their crimes often included small town bank robberies, holding up coach services, and also holding up people in remote areas, farms and things like that. It's been calculated that during the 19th century, there were about 2,000 bushrangers at large over the whole of Australia. The first ones were convicts who bolted from the convict chains, etc. Probably Ned Kelly is the best known of these, and his last stand at Glenrowan is legendary. In Western Australia, before the convict era, most of the convicts were locally accused or imprisoned for local crimes, not from away. And they raided isolated homesteads for guns, food, and very often horses. The first reference I've found to the bush rangers over here appears in the Perth Gazette in July of 1834, and I quote, under the title Bush Rangers, it says, "The two men, Paget and Reed, who escaped from jail last week, are still at large, living in the bush upon the successful depredations they committed during the first few days of their liberty. Their first attempt was made on Saturday night last at the office of the Surveyor General." That was in St George's Terrace. "They gained admission by removing some bricks from the foundation of the building and by scraping a hole in the sand beneath sufficiently large to admit their creeping through." They were often menaces on the York Road, and they would hold up coaches and wagons. There was an Irish convict in the 1860s, James Lilly, who became a well-known and notorious horse thief. He stole teamsters and often demanded food from isolated houses. And it's said on one occasion that he went up behind a farmer, stuck something in his back and said something to the effect of "your money or your life." And when the farmer turned round, he found he'd been bailed up with a cabbage stalk, not a gun. Lilly had the reputation for procuring only the best horses, and he went through them with consummate ease. In 1860, whilst on the run after being accused of stealing Henry Mead's best horse — Mead was a merchant in Guildford — he wrote to the Inquirer newspaper seeking clemency. And his little letter, which was printed, says, "I, James Lilly, wish to inform the settlers of my going into the bush. If His Excellency," that's the governor, of course, "be pleased to allow me to go to my friends in another colony, what I have done I will restore to everyone uninjured, and if not, would sooner die than come out of the bush." To this letter, the editor of the Inquirer wrote, "This is the most coolly impertinent letter we have ever received. This scamp presumes to dictate terms and to threaten. That this man should be at large to pen such an epistle is a reproach to the police authorities." Well, all I can say is the editor didn't have to print it, but of course he did, because it sold more newspapers. Probably the best known bushranger in Western Australia is this chap, Joseph Belitho Johns, alias Moondine Joe. He was born in a little seaside town just outside Cardiff, Barry. Now, I don't want you to draw any conclusions from this, but that's where Julia Gillard was born as well. That's by the by. He was accused and found guilty of theft, and he was given a 10-year imprisonment sentence and transported to Western Australia in 1853. 2 years later, he was freed on a conditional pardon and worked in the 2J area. 2J was then called Newcastle, and was arrested on suspicion of stealing a horse and other offences soon after he got his conditional pardon. He was imprisoned in 2J jail and escaped and destroyed the horse, threw him into a pit of quicklime, and also destroyed the brand that had branded the horse, therefore destroying all the evidence, because he knew that he would get a much shorter sentence for jailbreaking than he would for taking a horse. So he went back to prison, and he was eventually released on a ticket of leave, and he went back to the Newcastle area and worked as a charcoal burner until he was convicted of killing an ox in 1865, for which he received yet another 10-year sentence. Then began this series of short-lived escapes. He really was the Houdini of Western Australia in the 19th century. And he always went back to the Moondine Hills. Let's have the Moondine Hills up, that's better. Around 2J and that area. And they would come and collect him and take him back to prison. Eventually, the authorities got fed up with his escapes. And so in Fremantle Jail, they built an escape-proof cell. Here it is. You can still see it to this day in 2J Jail. I think Bunnings must have made a killing on nails the day they built that. If you look, it's absolutely full of them. There he stayed for the rest of his life. He died in 1900 and is buried in Fremantle Cemetery, from where I don't think he's actually escaped. Our next subject is this lady, Elizabeth Shaw, always known as Eliza. She was born in Newmarket in Suffolk, so on the eastern side of Britain, in 1791. Her father was an army officer, and during her childhood, she moved to Dublin. And there she met this dashing young military gentleman, William Shaw, Captain William Shaw, and they married in Dublin in 1813. Soon after the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Shaw, like many army officers at the time, was retired on a full pension. I don't think we've got many pensioners here. I usually say hands up who's on a full pension, and not a single hand goes up, of course. That was fine, and they went back to his native county of Leicestershire, which is in the middle of England, and farmed. During the 1820s, the agricultural community was suffering badly from bad seasons, bad economics, bad agricultural science. And if it weren't for his army pension, they would have probably gone bankrupt. But in 1826, the British government started looking at its finances and asked the question, why have we got all of these retired army officers? None of them were old retired, they were just pensioned out of the army on full pay pensions. And without consulting with anybody, and in fact not even telling some of them, they reduced it to half pay. This meant an awful lot of those officers were living way above their means, and that included the Shaw family. By then, Will and Eliza had 6 children. I should say also that Eliza kept very detailed diaries. They're now in the Mitchell Library over in Sydney, and they make very interesting reading. In 1828, and we don't know whether it was because Will saw one of the very exaggerated advertisements that appeared in the British papers about the proposed Swan River colony here in Western Australia, this colony that was going to be set up in this utopia. Beautiful climate, wonderful fertile soil, lots of fresh water. I don't know where they got any of those ideas from. And they decided that they would emigrate here and bring the family out. Now, for those that don't know, the Swan River colony was to be the first free colony in Western Australia. The only other 2 colonies were New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, which were penal colonies. This one was set up on a land grant system. You sold up, bought whatever you thought you needed to start life over here again, and any remaining money that you had free, you would invest in the Swan River colony, and they would give you an allocation of land in return. Now, when the Shaws had settled their estate in Britain, they had £1,400 at their disposal, which in theory would have provided them with 18,000 acres of land here. From Britain, that sounded like a very good deal indeed. 8 members of the Shaw family, the 6 children, and mum and dad, decided to emigrate. They took with them 2 servants. Will managed to persuade one of his agricultural workers to come to help him look after the livestock on the boat. And Eliza went to the local workhouse, the poorhouse, and recruited a 15-year-old girl to act as nanny for the 6 children, who were in age from about 2 to 11 or 12. They got on board the Egyptian. Oops, let's go back one, sorry. There we are. Oh, I haven't got the Egyptian in there, never mind. Which left Gravesend on the 15th of September, 1829. The journey took 5 months. You never complain about a Qantas flight again, will you? Even if it does stop in Mauritius or wherever it did. And from the moment they got on the boat, there was a chapter of accidents. Within days of leaving Gravesend, All 6 children had gone down with whooping cough, which is pretty serious today. Luckily, they all survived. And during the long journey, things got a little problematic. The farm labourer hit the bottle, and as Eliza remarked in her diary, gave great impertinence. So he was obviously extremely rude. And the 15-year-old nanny was far more interested in the dashing young sailors than she was with her shore charges. And Eliza conceded in her diary, so many men on board a ship would corrupt the morals of a saint. They then nearly lost their oldest son, Nathaniel, Nat, as he was always known. He was watching 2 of the sailors haul in a shark to supplement their rations, and he fell overboard. And luckily, they got a boat out to him and rescued him before he either drowned or was taken by a shark. And Eliza later wrote, "Providence had prompted me before we came on board to tell all the young ones, should they fall overboard, to keep treading water as if they were going upstairs." Well, it obviously worked. They arrived in Fremantle on the 14th of February 1830, and it has to be said, their first impressions were not that favourable. Now, ladies, you will relate to this one. They came to Western Australia and landed somewhere in this area. They were expecting one of the officials, perhaps James Stirling or John Septimus Roe, to come down to the boat and tell them where their land was. Nobody turned up. So, ladies, you'll recognise this. The chaps in the party said, well, we'll go up the river to Perth and see if we can find James Stirling. You set up camp on the beach. Does that sound familiar of us blokes? Yeah, it did. They came back 3 days later with very unfavourable news. They had eventually found James Stirling padding round the garden of what is now Government House in a dressing gown with no shoes on, which clearly offended them greatly. And they also discovered that no land had so far been allocated. And I'll let Elizabeth's diary take up the story for a moment. She wrote, "Out of the 1,800 souls now come to this colony in the hopes of living, or at least not starving to death, there are not a dozen who know what to do or where they are to go. The people here look actually horror-struck at one another in absolute despair. There are some who have been here for 9 months and have sown different seeds at different times, but they have all invariably died away, and there is not one who has been able to raise either potatoes, cabbages, or any other vegetable. The man who described this land as good deserves hanging 9 times over. Each side of the river is nothing more or less than sand, white sand, incapable of being made to produce anything for the sustenance of man." Now, we all know about the white sand, don't we? The British author Anthony Trollope visited Perth in 1872, and he described the soil here as eminently suitable for hourglasses. Sums it up completely, doesn't it? 8 months later, in October, they finally managed to acquire not the 18,000 acres of land they were expecting, but just under 4,000 acres in the Upper Swan Valley. And they went up the river to start building their house. I put those in the wrong order. That was good, wasn't it? So, soon after they got up there and had started building, Eliza went down with dysentery, and she and the younger children had to go back down the river to friends to be looked after, leaving Will and Nat and the 2 younger sons to build their property. And in November, about a month later, the 2 younger boys were playing on the banks of the Swan River, and the Leicestershire ram they had bought to start their sheep flock actually butted them into the river. And before Will could get to them, both boys drowned. This, not unnaturally, broke Will's reserve, and he never did recover from it. However, they carried on building, and by 1833, this is the house. People here, it's still around, it's just south of the junction of West Swan Road and the Northern Highway. People here call it Belvoir, Belvoir. Those of us from England would call it Beaver, because it's a place in Leicestershire where they had their farm. And the British have a strange habit of spelling something one way and saying it another. Australians just add or subtract letters. We just completely changed the nature of the thing. So, by 1833, they were established at Beaver, and Eliza wrote in her diary, "Our heads are above water. Our ground is allowed to be the best on the river of its size. The scenery is beautifully park-like, and the idea that as far as the eye can see is all our own is very pleasing." They continued there. Sadly, Will died in May of 1862, but Eliza remained at the property with one of her younger sons, George, and they together managed the property very successfully. It's interesting that between 1865 and 1871, they had 19 ticket of leave men working for them, so you can see the size of the estate. Sadly, in 1875, there was an outbreak of diphtheria in Perth, and poor George succumbed and died. Now, unfortunately, that left Eliza with a big financial problem. A year or two before, George had taken out a mortgage with the bank to buy some more land. And at that time, women weren't even allowed to have a bank account, let alone a mortgage. So the bank foreclosed on the mortgage, and Eliza wrote in her diary on the 21st of, on the 10th of March, 1876, "Poor dear Beaver is advertised for sale, to save from God knows what." She went to live with one of her daughters in Geraldton, where she died in August of 1877. But I think their story just shows how hard and tough it must have been in those early years of the Swan River colony. Nobody had Google to see what things were like, and nobody understood. They'd all come from the Northern Hemisphere. So for a start, the seasons were upside down, and it was pretty confusing. Finally, as we're in Fremantle, I thought you'd be interested in this little story. This is about a chap called Bully Hayes. The C.W. Bradley, a bark under an American flag, came into alongside at Long Jetty, of course the inner harbour wasn't open then, in January of 1857. On board was the owner of the ship, a notorious pirate and conman, William Hayes. They arrived from Singapore and Batavia on the ship, and unbeknown to anyone here, William had been on a spending spree. Well, he'd been on a spree round the merchants and the markets of both Singapore and Batavia. And he'd collected what today we would now call luxury goods. He'd go round and buy up. His patter was, "I don't carry money with me, so if you come to the C.W. Bradley, at a certain time on a certain date, I will repay you from the ship's coffers." And of course, they turned up on the quayside to guess what? No ship. It had sailed. So it sailed into Fremantle Harbour with this gentleman on board. He was a very handsome, tall man. He was 6'4", which was tall in those days. And he managed to ingratiate himself to the Perth and Fremantle society. That was in sharp contrast to the chap the crew knew. He was vicious and he was a bully. On the journey over here, apparently he came up from below deck one day to find that the ship was just 1 degree off the set course. He was so angry he threw the helmsman across the deck into one of the masts, breaking the poor man's collarbone, arm and several ribs. Here, they thought he was a delightful chap. He had a very good singing voice. He was always well dressed, and he really did get in with society. He was also very popular with the ladies. In fact, within a week or two of being here, he had got engaged to Miss Scott, the daughter of Daniel Scott, the Fremantle harbour master, and he gave her this gold necklace, which is now in the WA Museum. She didn't know it was stolen goods. Anyway, he sold his illicit cargo, and with the money he made, which was probably quite a lot, he had the bark converted into a passenger liner. And he announced that he would take people to Adelaide. At that time in the 1850s, the economy of Western Australia was still pretty precarious, and quite a lot of people were moving to the new colony of South Australia in preference to being here. He advertised the fares as cabin £15, steerage 10, and he had 6 in cabins and 8 in steerage, and the bark left Fremantle in May. By the time he returned, news of what had happened in Singapore and Batavia had got here. But somehow he talked his way out of it and was allowed to take another 99 passengers to Port Adelaide the following month. By that time, the news had got to Adelaide, and they seconded the ship and sold it to pay off the debts. And during that time, Hayes happily got married to an Adelaide widow, Amelia Littleton. He avoided jail again, and he left with that wife, who didn't know he had an engagement in Fremantle, or that he had a wife in Indonesia. So over the next 20 years, he had various ships, and he followed a life of dishonesty, bigamy, and piracy. His comeuppance came off the Marshall Islands in March of 1877. He was murdered on the boat. The Loftus was the name of the boat, during a mutiny that was actually of his own provocation. It's said that Hayes was shot with a revolver, struck on the skull with an iron implement of some sort, and then thrown overboard. And actually, no one seems to have been particularly concerned at his death. Indeed, the murderer, Peter Radek, or as he was known on the boat, Dutch Pete, was treated as a hero. Ladies and gentlemen, heroes, villains and vagabonds. Thank you.